Welcome to This Explainer. Today, we're diving into a real-life medical detective story surrounding what is arguably the most exhausting part of childbirth. We're going to unpack a fascinating recent study from the American Journal of Obstetrics and Gynecology that uses hard data to challenge the very timelines that doctors have relied on for decades.
All right, let's kick things off with part one, the labor time limit.
I want you to just imagine for a second that you're right there in the delivery room. It's a moment of immense, total physical exhaustion. But behind the scenes, there's a clock ticking, and patients often wonder, is there an actual safe limit to how long active pushing should take? I mean, you hear wild stories of people pushing for 3 hours and others for 20 minutes, but what does the data actually say about that ticking clock?
Just so we're all on exactly the same page, let's translate the clinical jargon here. The second stage is that final window that includes the active pushing phase. It officially kicks off when the cervix is fully dilated to 10 centimeters, and it ends the exact moment the baby is delivered. Sounds super straightforward, right? But exactly how long this phase should last is a question that has, honestly, frustrated experts for a long time.
Currently, the medical guidelines offer what seem like pretty generous time limits. Traditionally, the pushing phase is considered prolonged if it passes 3 hours for first-time mothers or 2 hours for those who have given birth before. But researchers are now looking at this and asking, wait, do the risks actually start climbing long before we hit those official limits?
Which brings us to part two, investigating the evidence.
To get a truly pristine data set, a team of researchers basically went into full medical detective mode. They started out with 734 records and meticulously filtered them down to just 26 highly rigorous studies. They totally stripped away things like case reports, twins, and prior cesarean deliveries just to isolate the exact, pure data they needed.
And what makes this methodology absolutely incredible is how they looked at the data. Instead of slapping on a simple prolonged versus not prolonged label, they evaluated health outcomes across continuous graded intervals of time. They were literally watching the clock, minute by minute, and separating the outcomes based on how many past births the patient had.
And that leads right into part three, the 1-hour tipping point.
So they crunched all this data, and a very specific, undeniably clear pattern emerged. The magic number? 60 minutes. Forget the old 2 or 3 hour limits for a second. The entire landscape of medical risk begins to fundamentally shift after just 1 hour of active pushing.
The trend here is just impossible to ignore. The researchers concluded that medical risks actually do not wait for that traditional 3-hour mark. Morbidity begins to rise within the very first hour. And as you'd probably guess, the longer pushing continues past that 60-minute mark, the higher the likelihood of adverse outcomes.
So, what exactly are those risks? Well, once the clock passes 60 minutes, the data shows a very measurable spike in maternal complications. We're talking about higher chances of cesarean delivery, and for every additional hour, the odds of postpartum hemorrhage, which is excessive bleeding, jumps significantly. We also see increased rates of severe perineal lacerations and infections like chorioamnionitis. The physical toll really does accelerate.
Moving right along to part four, first-time versus experienced mothers.
Now, if you know anything about obstetrics, you know a first labor is a totally different ballgame than a second or third. The researchers split the data by something called parity. Nulliparous means a patient who is delivering their first baby, while multiparous refers to someone who has delivered before and typically has a much shorter pushing phase.
But here is the wild part. Surprisingly, whether it's baby number 1 or baby number 3, the risks for maternal morbidities begin to increase in a very similar way after that first hour. Even though experienced mothers usually have faster deliveries overall, if their active pushing phase does extend beyond 60 minutes, their risk for complications climbs just like it does for first-time mothers. The biological clock, it seems, is actually pretty strict.
Let's shift gears for part 5, outcomes for the baby.
Because, childbirth is a two-patient scenario. For first-time moms pushing past 60 minutes, the infant actually faces increased risks of needing the NICU and having lower initial APGAR health scores. Though interestingly enough, the researchers found no significant link to fetal acidemia, which is a dangerous acidity in the baby's blood.
But for experienced moms, here's where the data gets super murky. The effects on their babies remain really uncertain. In this entire, massive, rigorous review, only a single study actually evaluated pushing duration and infant outcomes specifically for multiparous individuals. It highlights a massive gap in the current medical literature where more research is just desperately needed.
Finally, let's wrap up with part 6, redefining birth guidelines.
So what does this all mean? Where does it leave us? The official summary from the journal really hits the nail on the head. Optimizing the management of this stage is absolutely vital. Medical providers need to realize that traditional timelines are associated with rising risks, and the safety landscape fundamentally shifts right at that 60-minute mark.
Now, I want to be absolutely clear here. The goal of this data is not to induce panic or mandate an immediate surgery the second you hit minute 61. Not at all. Rather, it's a call for individualized care. Once that first hour passes, care teams should be closely evaluating variables like epidural status and maternal fatigue, rather than just blindly relying on a rigid 3-hour countdown.
And that leaves us with a pretty provocative final thought. If you are drafting a birth plan, or maybe you're a provider managing labor, how does knowing that the risk curve steepens at 60 minutes change your strategy? It really highlights both the incredible endurance required during labor and the precision science needed to keep everyone safe. Thanks for joining me for this explainer, and remember to always keep questioning the numbers behind the guidelines.